Well, thank you very much for your nice introduction, and I'd like to thank Korea Institute, and especially Professor Hyung-Ha Kim and Jim Fox. I wish he were here. I think he's in Korea now still? Yes. Yes. For inviting me for a 1 month fellowship. I really enjoy staying here. This is my first visit to ANU, and I'm very impressed in many ways. Very pleasant place and a good place to study it. and Professor McIntyre for your warm hospitality in the College of Pacific and Asian Studies. And of course, most of all, I'd like to thank all of you for coming to my lecture this afternoon. It's really great to see growing interest in Korean Peninsula on this campus. I heard many students are now interested in Korean studies. My talk is about the way Korean society is changing under the impact of globalization. In particular, I'm interested in looking at some important changes occurring in the structure of social inequality and the way people are pursuing status and social mobility in this age of globalization. Globalization is a huge reality, as you know, and hardly any economy and society in the world is unaffected by this powerful force of globalization. But in many ways, South Korea has been experiencing globalization much faster and at a much more intensive scale than most of the countries in the recent years. The South Korean government adopted globalization as its major policy goal in the mid-1990s and has aggressively pursuing globalization strategy to transform its economy, polity, and society ever since. A major impetus to this policy change was the so-called Asian economic crisis, or Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s. To avoid the sudden foreign currency crisis in 1997, South Korea accepted $57 billion bailout from the IMF. And in return, South Korea had to put its economy under the IMF's stringent structural adjustment programs and had undergone a series of neoliberal reforms. But these changes were not just simply forced by outsiders. What the IMF crisis, which is the way Koreans like to call it, as an IMF crisis rather than just financial crisis, what the IMF crisis did was to bring neoliberalism as a dominant policy framework, or a hegemonic ideology, you may call it, among Korean policymakers. Even during the progressive or leftist regimes of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, of course leftist by Korean standard, neoliberal globalization was the dominant policy orientation, and this orientation had powerful effect in reshaping not only the economy, but also major social institutions. Much has been written about and studied about the way South Korean economy has evolved since the financial crisis and how its well-known developmental state has been transformed. But little attention has been given so far to the ways Korean society and people have been changing in this process. So this is what I want to talk about in my talk. One of the most well-known consequences of neoliberal globalization over the world is the increasing economic inequality. Economic inequality has grown noticeably in all societies in the recent period, and there is a general consensus among scholars that this growing inequality is directly related to neoliberal globalization. This certainly has been the case in South Korea. South Korea has been a relatively egalitarian society until recently, as far as income distribution is concerned. And this was due to a variety of historical and institutional factors, such as the extensive land reform during the post-World War period and the impact of Korean War, the rapid economic growth and job creation, and especially the role of the strong egalitarian-oriented developmental state. But recently, income distribution has worsened since 1990s, and the gaps between the rich and the poor have widened significantly. The major turning point was again the financial crisis in the 1990s. The IMF-mandated economic restructuring program entailed huge consequences, triggering a huge number of business failures, sharp increase of unemployment, frozen wages, and decreased income, curtailment of non-wage benefits, and growing number of homeless people. All these economic troubles meant a serious blow to the Korean middle class, a large-scale layoffs of white-collar and managerial workers, and the collapse of many small businesses meant a large amount of downward mobility among the previously middle-class families. Many surveys were conducted during and after the financial crisis, and they confirmed that the size of the middle class declined significantly from about 60 to 70% of the population to about the 50% level. And it is in this gloomy economic context, a widespread sense of uneasiness about the future among Korean middle class, that the discourse of the disappearing middle class was widely discussed. The collapse of the Korean middle class has become a dominant public discourse, echoed by all major Korean newspapers and political parties and many academicians. But this is not the whole story of the financial crisis. If you look at the whole range of the middle class, we notice not all of the middle class people suffered from this financial crisis. In fact, the affluent segment of the middle class did not suffer the financial crisis, but instead they actually benefited from it because the crunched financial market during the financial crisis provided the golden opportunities for them to invest in real estate and stock markets. And the rebound of the Korean economy in the subsequent years brought handsome profits to these resource-rich middle-class people. Thus, what the financial crisis did was not to cause a downfall of the middle class en masse, but internal division of the middle class. With a large majority, while a large majority of the middle class suffered tremendously and continue to face consequence of downsizing and flexibilization in the labor market, a tiny segment of the middle class enjoyed prosperity in the changing economic environment. Increasingly, these two segments of the middle class are separated not only economically, but also spatially and culturally. But it is not just the increasing economic inequality or polarization that is what I am primarily concerned about. As far as economic polarization is concerned, economists can provide more accurate information about and analysis about it. What I'm interested in is the way this economic inequality is transformed into social and cultural inequality, and how globalization process has modified the context in which class relations are becoming restructured. The central thesis I hope to advance is that globalization provides differential opportunity structures for different classes of people and helps consolidate inequality that is generated within the economic structure in the form of social, cultural, and symbolic inequality. The consequence is the hardening of class boundaries and reduced social mobility. Class competition occurs increasingly in the global arena, and requisites for social mobility are increasingly defined by global standards, and they are to be obtained in the global market. I'd like to discuss two primary mechanisms through which globalization impacts the class system. One is consumption, and the other is educational process. Of course, consumption plays an important role in the status distinction in all modern societies. In fact, maintaining a certain respectable level of consumption has always been regarded as essential requirement for middle-class status in South Korea. But until 1980s, when restricted consumption was forced by the state, Koreans consumed mostly domestic products with no great varieties and not much quality differences. In such circumstances, consumption played a rather modest role in discriminating class distinctions. But in the new age of globalism, consumption emerged as a major arena and mechanisms of class distinction, arguably more important than the production system. The most interesting to notice is the rise of the luxury market, luxury product market. The main target of the luxury or the brand name products is the new rich, whose economic status is substantially higher than the majority of the middle class, and therefore desire to distinguish themselves from the ordinary middle class people. In a sense, luxury product serves as a status marker for the people who became rich but are insecure with their status. Through exclusive consumption linked to the image of global bourgeois culture, the affluent segment of the Korean middle class seeks to establish a new class identity above the rest of the middle class. The focus of status competition has thus shifted from the division between the middle class and the working class, which was the case in the previous years, to the one separating the affluent middle class from the larger middle class. All these changes are closely related to the nature of global capitalism in the current era. The current stage of global capitalism has produced tremendous quantity and variety of goods and made them available worldwide while removing all the trade barriers and constantly valorizing and glamorizing the consumption of these goods. These goods are both material and symbolic goods. Global capital mobilizes cutting-edge science and technological knowledge and produces all the new things that promise human beings to enjoy more comfortable, healthy, and luxurious life. The wealthy people can now enjoy not just conspicuous luxury consumption, but actually many life-enhancing products like new medicines, drugs, healthy foods, safer vehicles, and all other things that are supposed to protect them from the risk society. Another crucially important arena of class distinction is education. Korean education system is full of irony. It is almost a model case in terms of international education performance scores, where Korean students score usually top or the second to the top. But inside Korea, education is the number one social problem for parents and children, of course. The reasons are complex and historical, but the gist of the problems is that the Korean educational system is too competitive, too exam-oriented, and too expensive, as educational competition is increasingly conducted in the off-school and the private educational markets. In recent years, neoliberal globalization began to have its own powerful impact and began to shape the educational process in a new way. The most important changes involve the rise of English as a critical qualification for good jobs and the expansion of educational opportunities overseas. These were the changes directly related to Korea's adoption of neoliberal globalization during the Kim Il-sung government. An important part of Kim's globalization, or in Korean 세계화 policies, included the promotion of English as an essential skill to be taught at schools as early as possible. Until 1980s, English was taught only at the secondary level schools. But in the 1990s, it was extended to the upper classes of elementary schools. Over the years, English has become an essential measure of test for both entering an elite university and obtaining a good job. English ability is essentially important for obtaining sought-after jobs in Korean conglomerate firms like Samsung, LG, Hyundai, and the like, as well as high-paying jobs in the multinational corporations. Since the 1990s, more and more companies in this elite league began to add job interviews in English as an important part of screening. Even where English is not required for job performance, English skill has become widely regarded as a measure of competence in this age of globalization. Those who lack adequate English skill are regarded as outdated and lacking proper cultural and social aptitudes required for the global business environment. The prominence given to English has grown since the 1997 financial crisis. Now, English is important not only for initial job appointment, but also for job recontract and promotion. Increasingly, English ability is what distinguishes between the first class and the second class employees in the globalized sector of the economy. Each year, competition for better English education has intensified among the middle class families. Many of them were not satisfied with English education available at public schools and sought better English education for their children in the private market. That prompted a tremendous expansion of private English education markets since the 1990s. According to one estimate, English educational market is estimated to be $10 billion per year, and it was found that 80% of parents with elementary and secondary school children are giving private English education of some kind. Since the late 1990s, a new trend among the middle class has appeared, and that is to send youngsters abroad for English education. The number of Korean students studying abroad has increased dramatically. Each year, a large elementary and secondary school students go abroad for a short-term or long-term English education in the United States, Canada, Australia, or Europe. In 2008, for example, more than 12,000 elementary students and 14,000 junior high and high school students went abroad. In the same year, as many as 217,000 students, Korean students, were enrolled in colleges overseas. In the United States, Korean college students constitute, according to statistics, the largest category of foreign students. I don't know what is the size in Australia, but I'm sure here too, Koreans constitute a very large majority, large category. This English education trend produced an interesting phenomenon of what is called kirogi families. Kirogi family. Kirogi means wild geese, and kirogi families are therefore wild geese families, refer to families in which children are studying overseas and their mothers are there to take care of their children while fathers remain in Korea and send money to their families. This novel form of transnational families appeared in South Korea from the 1990s. Of course, the dominant reason for this unusual form of family practices is to make children learn English at an early age and give them a better and more cosmopolitan education in the advanced Western countries. A considerable proportion of these kirogi families are the ones which had been to America, Europe, or I guess Australia, related to fathers and very rarely mothers' overseas job assignment, or the parents' sabbatical leave in the case of academics. Started as a new global strategy of mobility among the high managerial and professional families, this strategy of global education was quickly adopted by a growing number of middle-class families. the size of the Kyrgyz families has grown so large, Koreans nowadays are talking about the different categories of Kyrgyz families. Some Kyrgyz fathers are called eagle fathers. Those who can afford to travel and visit their children and wives fairly frequently. But there are other opposite cases called penguin fathers. Those fathers who are stuck in Korea cannot travel to see their families. So these changes have a definite impact on the structure of the middle class and on the entire class structure, and that is I'm primarily interested in from a sociological point of view. Korean middle class was by and large a product of Korean economic development in the past 4 decades or so. Until the late 1980s, the middle class represented a relatively homogeneous and fluid class. Entering the middle class was relatively easy, and once entered, one could expect a gradual mobility upward with increasing seniority at work and improving living standard. But gradually, noticeable divergence began to occur within the Korean middle class, and from the 1980s, and the financial crisis greatly aggravated this inequality structure. But if the growing economic disparity were contained within the economic realm, the problems of class inequality in Korea would not have been so serious. For the economic fortunes of the individual families could change more easily, and income differentials constitute a gradual hierarchy rather than categorical ones. But the fact is, with the liberalization of Korean economy, the consumption market has expanded tremendously. As mentioned before, the globalized consumption market is not just to provide material goods, but also all kinds of symbolic goods that were needed, that were used for status distinction. Class boundaries became more clear and less permeable. And then followed the privatization and globalization of education market, which introduced a whole new dynamics in the stratification system. Increasingly, competence and cultural skills are defined by global standards, and they must be acquired in the globalized market. Simply, educational competition has become globalized. Under these circumstances, the gaps between the affluent middle class and the other families has widened. Parents' economic resources are directly translated into children's advantages in education and social mobility. In other words, economic capital is directly translated into cultural and symbolic capital. Thus, in the new liberal global order, class privileges take on different dimension from what they used to mean during the early development period. Now, you must be wondering, what about cosmopolitanism, which I put in my title? Okay. I haven't mentioned much about anything about the cosmopolitanism so far. Well, I partly use the term to make my title more juicy and attract more attention. But I wanted to reconceptualize the meaning of cosmopolitanism from a third world perspective. Academically, the original meaning of cosmopolitanism refers to a certain moral and philosophical orientation. It means, as some scholars define it, a set of values and principles based on the premise that as members of humanity, all persons are in a fundamental sense equal and free and deserve equal political treatment regardless of their origin. Cosmopolitans are therefore committed to the idea that all persons are in a fundamental sense equal and free. Cosmopolitanism implies both moral and ethical orientation, as well as political attitude and commitment. Therefore, recently, scholars like Ulrich Berg and David Held prefer to use the cosmopolitanism as a kind of political project to build cosmopolitan democracy and global civil society, aiming to render global institutions more democratic and universalistic in the genuine sense of the serving all humanity. But this is not what I mean by cosmopolitanism here. Then am I distorting the concept? Perhaps, or perhaps not. We must understand that cosmopolitanism in the original sense represented a philosophical and aesthetic inclination of the intellectuals of the Europe. But in actual world, such a lofty meaning of cosmopolitanism is rare and not that relevant. Thus nowadays, there are scholars who are working with this concept and are beginning to talk about what they call ordinary cosmopolitanism or everyday cosmopolitanism. As such, cosmopolitanism refers to the open-mindedness to the other, a willingness to engage with people of different cultures, races, and nationalities. In ordinary language, cosmopolitans refer to those who have traveled abroad much, those who are familiar with other cultures, and feel comfortable in maneuvering in foreign environments. I think this common sense understanding of cosmopolitanism useful, but not sufficient. I think it is very important to understand cosmopolitanism in context. What I mean is that basically cosmopolitanism could imply different things in different contexts. If cosmopolitanism involves a high intellectual orientation in Western Europe, in most other third world countries, it implies acquisition and familiarity with cultures of Western developed nations or those of the metropolitan centers of global capitalism. As world system theorists argue, the world capitalist system is divided into three zones: core, semi-periphery, and periphery. Those who are highly educated and aspire to be cosmopolitan in the periphery or semi-periphery countries are eager to adopt the cultural patterns and cultural skills prevalent in the metropolitan center of the core. And the ever tighter integration of the world economy in the current era and the dominance of giant transnational corporations make it more imperative to acquire skills and cultural aptitudes of the core in order to achieve occupational success. Concretely, it involves English fluency, degrees from the US, Canada, Europe, or Australia, work and life experience in these countries, familiarity with institutional rules and operations in the West, a network of friends across countries and the like. This is exactly why the tens of thousands of aspiring students from Asia are coming to this country and the United States. Looked at from this perspective, I think it is useful to think of cosmopolitanism as not simply as humanistic ethical orientation, but as a sort of cultural competency or cultural repertoires. Or using the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu's concept, we can define cosmopolitanism as a form of cultural capital. So what I'm arguing is that this new form of global cultural capital is increasingly important for Koreans to move into the elite positions. And this cultural capital is to be obtained abroad in the global context. it requires a lot of money, of course. So it is the route to be taken mainly by affluent middle class. That means globalization provides differential opportunity structures to different classes. And the affluent middle class now enjoy two strategies of social mobility for their children and the class reproduction. One can be called cosmopolitan strategy of mobility, and the other one is a domestic strategy of mobility. Which of the two strategies are important depends upon, again, historical and institutional context of the society. In Korea, we can see that cosmopolitan strategy is becoming more and more important than domestic strategy. If you compare Korea with Japan, Japan is quite different. Still, in Japan, the upper class people prefer the domestic strategy of mobility. Simply speaking, in Korea, a degree from Harvard or Cambridge is now as preferable or even more preferable than degrees from Korean elite universities, Seoul National University or Korean universities. In Japan, for example, Tokyo University degree is still far more important than degrees from Harvard. It is related to the class structure in the society. In Korea, the old Yangban, the aristocratic class was completely destroyed after the World War II and through land reform. And the globalization process has proceeded far more aggressively and unprotected manner. Well, anyway, what I'm arguing is that neoliberal globalism accentuates inequality in South Korea, not just economic inequality, but also social and cultural inequality. Economic power in the neoliberal era is translated into symbolic power and to the privileged opportunities in obtaining social mobility assets. And these opportunity structures are becoming increasingly privatized and globalized. And neoliberalism provides powerful ideological and discursive legitimation for the individualistic pursuits of mobility assets in the globalized consumption and education markets. Okay, this is, I didn't want to make it. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much on behalf of, I'm sure, everybody here and myself, and that I personally never thought that this extensively, that what does really imply for these careers and this upcoming craze of this English desire and this consumption, this desire. When you go to Korea, as probably Paul would agree with me, it's just you can practically feel your eyes popping, because just all the streets are filled with these extraordinarily good-looking ladies with a dress, and then they speak English. It's like even 5-year-old kids, reasonable family, they speak English now. So I never thought that is really to do with now the ways to forming new class structure. But now I really can see what Professor is now giving us, and to me, this about this cosmopolitan strategy. I think that really links. I think it's not only Korean case. Will you share with this, particularly this Asian region, where it's just the English, this learning desire of the English language is so acute, whilst we don't have enough number to supply, and the economic prosperity is reasonably above than anywhere else. So I'm sure that among you, we've got a lots of questions to ask. So let me just have this poetry. We have to finish here by next, let's say, let me accept 20 minutes for discussion. What do you think? Is that all right? So, floor is yours. Anyone wants to have a question? Oh, okay. If you don't mind, if you can just introduce yourself very briefly, and I can paint it to know who you are.
Paul Hutchcroft from the School of International Political and Strategic Studies here at the ANU. Fascinating talk, and want to thank you for your insights on globalization and class structure. And I want to ask a bit more about the larger picture of changing class structure in South Korea. And I know you're the right person to ask. And that is, what's happened to the working class? Is there shrinking numbers that one can presume, and how do we better understand the boundaries between classes as they've changed as well? And a related question, I'm wondering whether we might sometimes, not just in analysis of Korea, but more generally, overuse the word middle class, because it seems to stretch from shopkeepers to captains of industry, and you've talked about the more affluent and the less affluent. I mean, is it a term that has come to encompass so much that it loses some of its value?
No. Yes, of course, the middle class is a very broad, kind of elusive concept, but nevertheless quite useful. That's why it is constantly used. It is difficult, even among sociologists, difficult to reach an agreement about how to define the middle class. Middle class includes the people who are not rich, not poor, not upper class, not lower class, somewhere in the middle in terms of occupational status, income, and education. But in Korea, it was a very kind of open class. People could move in, and then, as I said, they can stay there, and then they can expect gradual mobility upward, because especially in the past 3 or 4 decades of economic development improved their living standard, and the job stability was there, so they gradually moved up. And then at that time, there was a sharp differentiation or break between the working class and the middle class. The working class was an industrial working class, and their working conditions and their social status was very poor, and they suffered tremendously. So in a sense, Korea's rapid economic development was possible on the basis of the exploitation of the working class. Actually, that is the subject I studied in the past many years, and I wrote a book about the Korean working class formation. But then, after democratization in the late 1980s, there occurred a very aggressive and the labor movement, and there emerged very powerful unions and conglomerate firms like Hyundai, especially, and these skilled workers, especially unionized skilled workers at these large firms, saw the tremendous improvement in their wages and the living conditions. So many of them regard themselves as belonging to the middle class rather than the working class. And the union movement, unfortunately, became more exclusive. The size of the union membership still remains about 12% of the working population. And these powerful unions at conglomerate firms are primarily interested in improving the conditions of their union members rather than the working class as a whole. So the working class movement has, in a sense, deteriorated. So working class itself became more or less polarized in some way. There is a kind of affluent or the segment of the working class, or some people call labor aristocracy, emerged, and which is a very small proportion of them. Whereas the majority of the working class people in the small enterprises, they suffer job instability, low wages, and the lack of union protection. So, yes, the working class conditions are very poor and very bad, and the small industries are moving their plants abroad, seeking low wages elsewhere. So this is the usual story of the working class. In that regard, the boundary between the middle class and the working class became diluted in some way, because the lower segment of the middle class sank because of the financial crisis, and then now restructuring and other things. Whereas small segment of the working class moved up, so that boundary that used to separate the middle class and the working class became less meaningful, but more significant class boundary occurred upward between the affluent middle class and the rest of the middle class and the working class. And that's what I was emphasizing.
Yes. No. More quickly.
Thanks for that fascinating talk. It's there's one thing when you were talking at the beginning about the role of the financial crisis and how that started in a way a crisis of the middle class and polarization within the middle class. One thing you haven't talked about is who were the winners, because you said there were lots of losers, but then there were a few winners. But what characterized those winners? What was the positional advantage that those winners within the middle class had? Were they people already with capital, so could we consider them already kind of the upper reaches of the middle class, or were people who had particular connections or particularly high education? Could you tell us who you think were the winners, what characteristics that those winners were? Because that seems to me quite important in order to understand whether that polarization is going to stay like that, or whether those characteristics can be applied to other people as well, and then somehow that polarization can be overcome over time. So whether that is a temporary situation, or whether you think it is for the long term.
Well, primarily there are two categories of winners. One, immediate winners were the people who had properties, who had extra apartment or land, and that's like in China, in Korea, the property market plays a very important role. So it is not just earned income, but this kind of property income, that plays a very important role. So as I said, that in a crunched credit markets, they maximize the value of their property and then expanded their property ownership. And then after the crisis, the real estate prices jumped up. So they were the very important winners. And then they are the ones who now try to translate their economic capital through their children, sending their abroad and etc. But second, winner was the people who are knowledge workers, who are highly educated, and especially with the foreign educations, because now increasingly the multinational corporations came in, and then Korean large firms adopted so-called American-style managerial practices, and are willing to pay very high wages to well-educated workers. So wage differentials within the same company increased tremendously. So this job market changes, and then winners appeared from there. And then with the globalization, there is a kind of venture capital, venture economies, all kinds of small venture enterprises were promoted, and some young people with a little financial resources and entrepreneurial skills, they invested in the venture capital. Although it did not go on too long, there was a crisis. But anyway, these are the two categories of people.
Now, before I accept any more questions, I've got 10 minutes, so I'm going to now find out. Andrew, you're going to, and then may I ask you your question? I just want to know how many that question people are wanting to have. And
so you wanted me to ask my question?
in a minute. So 2 and John 3. Anybody else wants to make a question? Oh, so we have 3.
If there's
Yes.
more, some of us are at dinner, we can drop out.
Yes, yes, yes. So if this dinner guest, if you have got a question to ask and we don't have any more time, and then I beg you that you hold your question until then. Yes, please, may I ask you then?
Yes, I'm Andrew Kipnis, also in CAP, I guess, College of Asia and Pacific. There's too many acronyms around. So I was fascinated by many aspects of your talk, but I want to go back to something you said near the end, where you were making that comparison with Japan, and how in Japan, Tokyo University is still more prestigious than the foreign ones. But in Korea, you have Seoul national universities becoming less prestigious than foreign universities. And certainly in China, I suspect it will be much more like the Japanese pattern. Now when you see the Chinese parents who send their children abroad, it's often, obviously, it's a class thing, you must have the money to do that, but it's also a realization that their children cannot compete in the Chinese system. So this is well, you know, we all know how slack they are in Australia. Send them there, maybe they'll be able to get to university. And what I'm seeing here, which is very interesting, is an aspect of the story seems to be Korea's position within East Asia. So a deliberate not looking to China and Japan for the high prestige, but rather, right, purposefully denying those. And I guess I also know there are a number of Korean students in China, but I guess that would not be very prestigious, although perhaps it may end up being quite profitable, I'm not sure. So wonder about, so what you see there. Is it, I remember reading, I don't know much about Korea, but aren't there some books about Christianity in Korea and having that has something to do with sort of this kind of tensions with Japan and China?
Yeah, China is an interesting case, and we have to watch how it changes. But I suspect the same way as you did, at least so far. Even Korea, until about 10 years ago, if I asked the parents, if your child has an option to go to Harvard and Seoul National University, which one would you choose? And probably up to about 10 years, most parents would still say, well, SNU, Seoul National University first. And then maybe after that, because social network is important and the companies emphasize, Koreanness and all those kind of aptitudes. But with this just rapid process of globalization, and I think South Korea's ambition to play as a global player in the East Asian regions. So Korea is just dashing outward. So more and more these cosmopolitan skills are appreciated, emphasized. But again, I think it is related to the class structure of the society. Of course, China also experienced the just dismantling of the old class structure. But I don't know. Still, this Confucian-based status distinction probably is becoming revived or I don't know. That is an interesting, I think, comparison to make. But anyway, as far as Korea is concerned, the lack of, in a sense, cultural hegemony enjoyed by the upper class in domestic upper class, that played one, and Korea's aggressive effort to globalize itself led to more valuing of the cosmopolitan skills, and I think.
Andrew?
If there's anyone other
Well,
than
I'm
John
not
and
going to
me,
dinner, so
yeah.
if I could just.
Yeah.
My name is Byung Hee. I'm an expatriate Korean Australian. I've been here for some time. It's very interesting to hear you talk today. And you mentioned that cosmopolitan really creates a special echelon of middle class in Korea. And I observed that in Western society, or at least in Australia, having a multilingual is a capability that is basically a necessity for global trading and globalization.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, so it doesn't really create any special sort of class categories. Whereas in Korea, you mentioned that it does create that echelon. But also, cosmopolitanism is happening too, not only at the upper echelon of the middle class, but I think it's also happening at the lower working class as well. Because I hear that a lot of cheaper labor is being imported by Korean businesses from Southeast Asian countries. So don't you think there's a cosmopolitanism really happening at the top as well as bottom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
It's more of us for the observation than question.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very interesting and good point. Yes, I think you could say that so-called what, as I mentioned, that what some people call ordinary cosmopolitanism, in a sense, kind of more willingness or sensitivity to the cultures and people of the other countries and other race. I don't know to what extent it is occurring, but yes, especially among some progressive, open-minded people among the Korean working class, and especially some people who were previously involved in the labor movement, and these people, they are very sensitive to the question of justice and humanity issues, and they are more sympathetic, and they are more willing to work for the cause of these people. So you may certainly call it as cosmopolitanism. Probably it is very limited. But yes, I think, thank you for the point.
Just as a substitute question, do you think that creating new middle classification through this cosmopolitanism and multilingual thing, do you think it will sort of continue? Or is it just a transitional thing?
I think it'll definitely continue, probably intensify. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, we are coming back to here. So,
I guess my question's coming from a similar place as Andy Kipnis. Appreciate that the story you want to tell is focusing on causal consequences of globalisation. I guess in a way I'm sort of wanting to ask you to turn your gaze back in the other direction and wonder about all sorts of possibilities of causality. And like Andy, I'm really interested in the way in which you pick up on tertiary education as an indicator. A very, very casual empirical impression would be that predating any particular recent administration in Seoul, predating not globalisation itself, but at least the big discussions of globalisation, I would say South Koreans have been disproportionately prominent in the English-speaking academic markets, whether as certainly relative to population, but I'd say even more than relative to population. And if I think of people in PhD markets, if I think of young academics, all sorts of prominent. South Koreans. And so I guess like Andy, I'm wondering if there may be some other factor beyond globalisation that's part of the causal story here, or not. So just put that to you as a question.
Yeah, I think that's true. The people who played an instrumental role in promoting Korean economic development is from the 60s and 70s. Well, they were the ones who were trained mostly in the United States and they received a PhD in economics and other areas. And why then, you ask, why more Koreans proportionately went abroad, especially US, and received higher educational degree, etc. Probably, as you mentioned, I think Christianity at that time played an important role. Many people who went abroad, especially to the United States, they went through the Christian network. They received some funding and encouragement by American ministers and went through that. So, and the reason why Christianity was more well accepted in Korea is, again, it's a historical thing, because Christianity and missionaries played a very positive role during colonial period. They supported the independence movement and they established some schools and etc. And so many aspiring, ambitious people became Christians, not necessarily for religious reasons, but for that kind of, as a kind of the ways to get higher education and go abroad, that kind of thing. So you can say that the globalization of higher education occurred even before the 80s and before the 90s. That's true. But still, there is a big difference in terms of the extent and the degree. During the Park Chung-hee or the Chun Do-han, during that so-called developmental decade, the Korean government was highly protective. It controlled the exchange, the rates exchange markets, and it controlled the foreign travels. So even for those people who have economic means, they could not send their kids abroad because the government prohibited it, and then they could not find a way to send money to their children. And there are many other restrictions. But then after financial crisis, all these restrictions were lifted. And not only that, this acquisition of English or foreign degrees is very much positively encouraged and emphasized. So these changes in the institutional arena really played a very, very important role, and it accentuated this globalization process.
We just have got just now time, so may I just accept John's one, please?
Actually, it was related to the previous question, which was asked almost in exactly the same terminology that I was going to use, in the sense of a cosmopolitan challenge from below because of the huge increase in migrant workers in Korea. But let me broaden this out, if I may, in terms of globalization and its impact on income inequality. One of the facets of globalization, of course, that everyone points to is the increasing mobility of factors of production. We see this then in migrant labor coming to Korea. We also see it in the increasing mobility of Korean capital. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering to what extent the Hyundai labor aristocracy is now under pressure, because, well, certainly a couple of years ago, if one used the prevailing exchange rates, Hyundai workers in Alabama were being paid less on an hourly basis than Hyundai workers in Korea. Now, presumably that is going to change the bargaining relationship between labor and capital. and in the medium term may have some further impact on income inequalities.
Mhm. That's a very interesting point. I didn't know that. So, but I don't know, what do you mean that?
Well, if Hyundai can say, instead of producing in Korea, we're going to ship our cars from Beijing, Hyundai, or from Alabama, it's going to weaken, I would assume, the power of the unions at Hyundai.
Sure, yes. Yeah.
And put a downward pressure on wages.
Wages for the unionized workers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure, yes. So so how does it relate to the?
Well, one is likely to see intensified income inequality if you have, at the same time, substantial influx of largely unskilled migrant workers at the lower end, but also skilled workers' positions coming under threat because of the internationalization of Korean industry.
So it would reduce the inequality within the wage workers, is that?
Possibly, but widen the gap overall
Widen?
between the working class and others.
Okay. Well, I think we have to introduce many other variables in order to predict the income differences. But yes, increasing competition of the Korean workers with the migrant workers, that reduce the income level of the unskilled workers, or the workers in smaller scale enterprises. But then another important thing is that the Korean economic industrial structure is somewhat polarized. There is a small number of conglomerate firms which are doing very well, like Samsung and Hyundai, and a very large number of the small enterprises. And the gap between the two, in terms of their economic performances, in terms of their profits, there is a huge differences. So just apart from this union power and etc., that the ability of the different scale of the enterprises to pay their workers, and in the case of the conglomerate firms, they are willing to pay high wages in order to assure the kind of peace with the labor unions, and that is one reason why their wages has increased so much. So I think that how this industrial structure will change, that certainly plays a very important role in determining the income distribution.
Thank you. Well, I apologize. I have to say that we end here this session. So please let me put together and thank you. Professor Hagen Koo is another giving a seminar on the 31st this month at the PSC. So please, you are most welcome. And we will sort of make it a little bit more sort of a second session where we're trying to encourage the professor to stay with us a little bit. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Bye.
Thank you.